In 1869, the Suez Canal was opened, and suddenly the Red Sea region was invested with great strategic and commercial importance. European colonial powers rushed for possession along the coast. Ultimately, the canal became too vulnerable to be left to the vagaries of internal Egyptian politics. The final insolvency of Caliph's Islam regime and the rise of an Egyptian nationalist movement promoted the British occupation of the country in 1882. This event had an ominous significance for Africa. It unleashed famous scramble to partition the continent. As far as the British was concerned, their occupation of Egypt forces them to become almost paranoid about another waterway, the Nile. For Egypt was a barren desert without Nile, a liability rather than an asset. Preventing a mortal enemy, France, from encroaching on the water of the Nile becomes a primary objective of British imperialism. While the British were prepared to guard the White Nile themselves, they want someone to watch over the Blue Nile and its Ethiopian source and tributaries. This was the genesis of Anglo-Italian collision over Ethiopia. The Italians were desperate to control Ethiopia, and the British were ready to support them as long as they acted a watchdog of British imperial interests. Although there was to be no compromise on the vital issue of independence, Ethiopian policy at both imperial and regional level tends to encourage European penetration. From the time of Tewodros, Ethiopian rulers had sought European allies for a number of reasons. The first and most obvious was the need for European armaments, either imported or, as in case of Tewodros, manufactured in Ethiopia. Regional rulers sought external allies to subvert their imperial overlords and improve their own chances to the throne. Emperor Johannes IV, as Casa Mircha, collaborated with the British against Tewodros in 1867 to strengthen his bid for succession. Menelik engaged in correspondence to a dubious nature with Egyptians, while Johannes was poised in hostile confrontation with them. Less ambiguously and more faithfully, Menelik cultivated assiduously the friendship of Italians, heedless of the warning of Johannes and undeterred by the bloody engagement in the north. The Italians reciprocated with even greater zeal. In Menelik they saw the perfect ally to subvert Emperor Johannes from the rear. The irony of the whole situation was that, starting as the best friends, Menelik and the Italians end up as the worst enemies. Although Ngus Menelik appeared highly accommodating in their interests, the Italians found their dismay that Ngus Menelik scarcely differed from Ngus Johannes on the vital question of Ethiopian independence. Direct contact with the Italians can be said to have officially begun in 1876 with the coming of geographical mission headed by Marquis Orazio Antioneri as the hinterland to Assab. Their first coastal acquisition. Shoah represented a logical line for their extension of interests. The mission itself was a good example of the interconnection between geographical exploration and colonial expansion, which had been a characteristic feature of colonialism in Africa. In the agreement that was concluded, Menelik obtained an agent to procure arms for him from Europe, and the mission secured a station at Let Marefia, near Ankober. In the following years, this post was to serve the Italians exceedingly well as a base for the gathering of intelligence. It was with the coming of Count Pietro Antonelli in 1882, however, that the rather sporadic contact assumed a deeper and more sustained character. It was to be Antonelli, a fate to preside over both the climax and the nadir of Italian relationship with Menelik, his brainchild. The Treaty of Charlie was to mark the diplomatic watershed of his career, marking at the same time the high point of friendship between the two parties and the beginning of hostility that inexorably led to ADWA. The path to Wuchale was itself marked by two treaties, which can be regarded as its precursors. The first was signed on 21 May 1883. It provided for consular exchange, free movement of people, free trade and free propagation of religion. But the two most important provisions were found in Article 12 and Article 13. Article 12 gave Italian subjects extraterritorial rights, an anticipation of the Klebkowski Treaty of 1908. Article 13 envisaged the possibility of Shoah foreign contacts, through intermediary of Italian consul at Assab, presaged the controversial Article 17 of the Ucali Treaty. The second treaty, more exactly, a conviction, was signed in October 1887 in the wake of the Italian defeat at Dogali and amidst preparation for revenge. The Italians wanted, at the very least, Menelik's neutrality in the impending conflict with Emperor Johannes. As a reward for this, Menelik was promised 5,000 Remington rifles. Both parties also made rather hollow-sounding pledges, Menelik not to use the arms against the Italians, the latter not to annex any Ethiopian territory. The Treaty of Ucale, drafted by Antonelli and signed by the two parties in May 1889 in Menelik's current camp there in Wallo, soon demonstrated how hollow indeed these pledges were destined to be. Article 3 granted the Italians considerable territory in the north in subsequent conviction signed in Rome in October by the Judge Makonnen Walde Michael, Menelik's cousin and now right-hand man. The Italians inserted the clause of effective occupation in order to legitimize their subsequent expansion towards the Marab River. But the height of Italians' colonial ambition was expressed in Italians' version of the Article 17, which bounded Menelik to make all his foreign contacts through the agency of Italy, thereby reducing Ethiopia to the status of Italian protectorate. In the eye of Menelik, the role prescribed for Italy was little more than that of glorified postman. Even as Shawan Nugus bidding for the throne, it is highly unlikely that he would have gone to the extent of seeking Italian protection. As Nugusa Nagas of Ethiopia, which he had become by the time of the Treaty of Ucale, it would have been a clear case of political suicide by virtue of this transformation of the status of Menelik. Therefore, Article 17, in its Italian form, could be said to have died before it was born. For Italians, things were much easier on the European front. With the exception of Russia, all the major powers recognized their protectorate claim on the basis of Article 17. This was not surprising. An African chief surrendering his sovereignty to an European power was a norm rather than the exception. In the case of Victorian England, prompt recognition was dictated by self-interest as well. But the Italians knew that the issue could only be resolved in Ethiopia. To achieve their objective, they followed parallel, if antithetical policies of persuasion in the south and subversion in the north. Antonelli and other emissaries tried hard, but in vain, to persuade Menelik to accept the Italian version of Article 70 of the Treaty of Ucale. His abrogation of the treaty in February 1893 dashed the last hope of the Italians to achieve their objective without resorting to arms. The policy of subversion in the north, masterminded by the governor of Eritrea, Antonio Baldizar, had two factors: territorial encroachment and inciting the Tigrayan prince to defect. The latter objective appeared to have been crowned with success with the Arab Convention of 6 December 1891, when the prince, headed by Ras Mengesha Yohannes, swore an oath of solidarity with the Italians. But the success was short-lived. In 1894, a large-scale revolt against their policy of land alienation was led by the Judge Bahata Hagos of Akala Guzai, erstwhile ally and arch collaborator with the Italians, and sounded the death knell of the policy of subversion. The rebellion was immediately followed by an armed clash between the Italians and Ras Mengesha, who had already formally submitted to Menelik. This example was to be followed by Ras Sabhat Aragawi and Judge Hagos Tafari, who turned against the Italians in the middle of the ADWA campaign. By the end of 1895, both diplomacy and subversion had thus failed to secure the Italians' colonial objective. Only the military option remained. The Italians took that option in October by crossing the Marab River and occupying Adirat. In the following weeks, Menelik mobilized a force of some 100,000 troops and, accompanied by his wife, Empress Taitu, marched north to meet them. His army was remarkable, not only for its size but also as an eloquent demonstration of national unity. There was scarcely any region in Ethiopia which are not sent a contingent. A state of affairs partially facilitated by the incorporation of the southern region into Menelik's empire. The first military engagement took place on 7 December 1895 at Ambalage, a natural fortress near the southernmost point the Italians had reached and already occupied by a force led by Major Tosley. The engagement was a unilateral attack by the vanguard force of Ethiopian army, while Mekonnen Walde Mikael, now Ras Mekonnen, was negotiating with the Italians for their peaceful evacuation. Fitaurari Gabeyo, undeterred by his own illness, led his men in a literally uphill struggle against the well-entrenched Italians. The Italians were routed. Their commander was among the casualties.